Chapter 4. Juno and her rivals, Io and Callisto, Diana and Actaeon, Latona and the Rustics. Juno one day perceived it suddenly grow dark, and immediately suspected that her husband had raised a cloud to hide some of his doings that would not bear the light. She brushed away the cloud and saw her husband on the banks of a glassy river, with a beautiful heifer standing near him. Juno suspected that the heifer's form concealed some fair nymph of mortal mould, as was indeed the case, for it was Io, the daughter of the river god Anacos, whom Jupiter had been flirting with, and when he became aware of the approach of his wife, had changed her into that form. Juno joined her husband, and noticing the heifer, praised its beauty, and asked whose it was and of what herd. Jupiter, to stop questions, replied that it was a fresh creation from the earth. Juno asked to have it as a gift. What could Jupiter do? He was loath to give his mistress to his wife, yet how could he refuse so trifling a present as a simple heifer? He could not without exciting suspicion, so he consented. The goddess was not yet relieved of her suspicions, so she delivered the heifer to Argus to be strictly watched. Now Argus had 100 eyes in his head, and never went to sleep with more than 2 at a time, so that he kept watch of Io constantly. He allowed her to feed through the day, and at night tied her up with a vile rope around her neck. She would have stretched out her arms to implore freedom of Argus, but she had no arms to stretch out, and her voice was a bellow that frightened even herself. She saw her father and her sisters, went near them, suffered them to pat her, heard them admire her beauty. Her father fed her a tuft of grass, and she licked the outstretched hand. She longed to make herself known to him, and would have uttered her wish, but alas, words were wanting. At length she bethought of writing, and inscribed her name, it was a short one, with her hoof on the sand. Anacos recognized it, and discovering that his daughter, whom he had long sought in vain, was hidden under this disguise, mourned over her, and embracing her white neck, he exclaimed, "Alas, my daughter, it would have been a less grief to have lost you altogether." While he thus lamented, Argus, observing, came and drove her away, and took his seat on a high bank from whence he could see all around in every direction. Jupiter was troubled at beholding the sufferings of his mistress, and calling Mercury, he told him to go and get rid of Argus. Mercury made haste, put on his winged slippers on his feet and his cap on his head, took his sleep-producing wand, and leaped down from the heavenly towers to the earth. There he laid aside his wings and kept only his wand, with which he presented himself as a shepherd driving his flock. As he strolled on, he blew upon his pipes. These were what are called the syrinx, or Pandean pipes. Argus listened with delight, for he had never seen the instrument before. "Young man," said he, "come and take a seat by me on this stone. There is no better place for your flocks to graze in than hereabouts, and here is a pleasant shade, such as shepherds love." Mercury sat down, talked, and told stories till it grew late, and played upon his pipes the most soothing strains, hoping to lull the watchful eyes to sleep. But all in vain, for Argus still contrived to keep some of his eyes open, though he shut the rest. Among other stories, Mercury told him how the instrument on which he played was invented. There was a certain nymph, whose name was Syrinx, who was much beloved by the satyrs and spirits of the wood, but she would have none of them, but was a faithful worshipper of Diana, and followed the chase. You would have thought it was Diana herself if you had seen her in her hunting dress, only that her bow was of horn and Diana's of silver. One day while she was returning from the chase, Pan met her, told her just this, and added more of the same sort. She ran away, without stopping to hear his compliments, and he pursued her till she came to the bank of the river, where he overtook her, and she only had time to call for help on her friends, the water nymphs. They heard and consented. Pan threw his arms around what he supposed to be the form of the nymph, and found he embraced only a tuft of reeds. As he breathed the sigh, the air sounded through the reeds and produced a plaintive melody. The god, charmed with the novelty and with the sweetness of the music, said, "Thus then, at least, you shall be mine." And he took some of the reeds, and placing them together of unequal length, side by side, made an instrument which he called syrinx, in honor of the nymph. Before Mercury had finished his story, he saw Argus's eyes all asleep. As his head nodded forward on his breast, Mercury with one stroke cut his neck through and tumbled his head down on the rocks. "O hapless Argus, the light of your 100 eyes is quenched at once." Juno took them and put them as ornaments on the tail of her peacock, where they remain to this day. But the vengeance of Juno was not yet sated. She sent a gadfly to torment Io, who fled over the whole world from its pursuit. She swam through the Ionian Sea, which derived its name from her, then roamed over the plains of Illyria, ascended Mount Haemus, crossed the Thracian Strait, thence named the Bosphorus, or the Cow's Ford, rambled on through Scythia, in the country of the Cimmerians, and arrived at last on the banks of the Nile. At length Jupiter interceded for her, and upon his promising to not pay her any more attention, Juno consented to restore her to her form. It was curious to see her gradually recover her former self. The coarse hairs fell from her body, her horns shrank, her eyes grew narrow, her mouth shorter. Hands and fingers came instead of hoofs to her forefeet. In time there was nothing left of the heifer except her beauty. At first she was afraid to speak, for fear she should low, but gradually she recovered her confidence and was restored to her father and sisters. In a poem dedicated to Leigh Hunt by Keats, the following allusion to the story of Pan and Syrinx occurs. "So did he feel who pulled the bough aside, that we might look into a forest wide, telling us how fair trembling Syrinx fled, Arcadian Pan with such a fearful dread. Poor nymph, poor Pan, how he did weep to find naught but a lovely sighing of the wind along the reedy stream, a half-heard strain, full of sweet desolation and balmy pain." Callisto. Callisto was another maiden who excited the jealousy of Juno, and the goddess changed her into a bear. "I will take away," said she, "the beauty with which you have captivated my husband." Down fell Callisto on her hands and knees. She tried to stretch out her arms in supplication. They were already beginning to be covered with black hair. Her hands grew rounded, became armed with crooked claws, and served for feet. Her mouth, which Jove used to praise for its beauty, became a horrid pair of jaws. Her voice, which if unchanged would have moved the heart to pity, became a growl more fit to inspire terror. Yet her former disposition remained, and with continual groaning she bemoaned her fate, and stood upright as well as she could, lifting up her paws to beg for mercy, and felt that Jove was unkind, though she could not tell him so. Ah, how often, afraid to stay in the woods all night alone. She wandered about the neighborhood of her former haunts. How often, frightened by the dogs, did she, so lately a huntress, fly in terror from the hunters. Often she fled from the wild beasts, forgetting that she was now a wild beast herself, and, bear as she was afraid of the bears. One day a youth spied her as he was hunting. She saw him and recognized him as her own son, now grown into a young man. She stopped and felt inclined to embrace him. As she was about to approach, he, alarmed, raised his hunting spear, and was on the point of transfixing her, when Jupiter, beholding, stopped the crime, and snatching away both of them, placed them in the heavens as the great and little bear. Juno was in a rage to see her rival set in honor, and hastened to ancient Tethys and Oceanus, the powers of ocean, and in answer to the inquiries thus told the cause of her coming. Do you ask why I, the queen of the gods, have left the heavenly plains and sought your depths? Learn that I am supplanted in heaven, my place given to another. You will hardly believe me, but look when the night darkens the world, and you will see the two of whom I have so much reason to complain, exalted to the heavens, in that part where the circle is the smallest, in the neighborhood of the pole. Why should anyone hereafter tremble at the thought of offending Juno, when such rewards are the consequence of my displeasure? See what I have been able to effect. I forbade her to wear the human form. She is placed among the stars. So do my punishments result. Such is the extent of my power. Better that she should have resumed her former shape, as I permitted Io to do. Perhaps he means to marry her and put me away. But you, my foster parents, if you feel for me, and see with displeasure this unworthy treatment of me, show it, I beseech you, by forbidding this guilty couple from coming into your waters. The power of the ocean assented, and consequently the two constellations of the Great and Little Bear move round and round in heaven, but never sink, as the others do, beneath the ocean. Milton alludes to this fact, that the constellation of the Bear never sets, when he says, "Let my lamp at midnight hour be seen in some high lonely tower, where I may oft outwatch the Bear." And Prometheus, in J.R. Lowell's poem, says, "One after one the stars have risen and set, sparkling upon the hoar frost of my chain. The Bear that prowled all night about the fold of the North Star has shrunk into his den, scared by the blithesome footsteps of the dawn." The last star in the tail of the Little Bear is the Pole Star, called also the Cynosure. Milton says, "Straight my nine hath caught new pleasures, while the landscape round it measures. Towers and battlements it sees, bosomed high in tufted trees, where perhaps some beauty lies, the cynosure of neighboring eyes." The reference here is both to the pole star as the guide of mariners and to the magnetic attraction of the north. He calls it also the Star of Arcady, because Callisto's boy was named Arcas, and they lived in Arcadia. Diana and Actaeon. Thus, in two instances, we have seen Juno's severity to her rivals. Now let us learn how a virgin goddess punished an invader of her privacy. It was midday, and the sun stood equally distant from either goal, when young Actaeon, the son of King Cadmus, thus addressed the youths who with him were hunting the stag in the mountains. Friends, our nets and our weapons are wet with the blood of our victims. We have had sport enough for one day. Tomorrow we can renew our labors. Now, while Phoebus parches the earth, let us put by our implements and indulge ourselves with rest. There was a valley thick enclosed with cypresses and pines, sacred to the huntress queen Diana. In the extremity of the valley was a cave, not adorned with art, but nature had counterfeited art in its construction, for she had turned the arch of its roof with stones as delicately fitted as if by the hands of man. A fountain burst out of one side, whose open basin was bounded by a grassy rim. Here the goddess of the woods used to come when weary with hunting, and wash herself in the sparkling waters. One day, having repaired thither with her nymphs, she handed her javelin, her quiver, and her bow to one, her robe to another, while a third unbound the sandals from her feet. Then the most skilful of them all arranged her hair, and the others drew water in urns. While the goddess was thus employed, behold, Actaeon, having quitted his companions and rambling without any special object, came to the place, led thither by destiny. As he presented himself at the entrance of the cave, the nymphs, seeing a man, screamed and rushed towards the goddess to hide her with their bodies. But she was taller than the rest, and overtopped them all by a head. Such a color as tinges the clouds at sunset or at dawn came over the countenance of Diana, thus taken with surprise. Surrounded as she was by her nymphs, she yet turned half away, and sought with a sudden impulse for her arrows. As there were none at hand, she dashed the water into the face of the intruder, adding these words, "Now go and tell, if you can, that you have seen Diana unapparelled." Immediately a pair of branching staghorns grew out of his head, his neck gained in length, his ears grew sharp-pointed, his hands became feet, his arms long legs, his body covered with a hairy spotted hide. Fear took the place of his former boldness, and the hero fled. He could not but admire his own speed, but when he saw his horns in the water, "Wretched me," he would have said, but no sound followed. He groaned, tears flowed down the face which had taken the place of his own. Yet his consciousness remained. What shall he do? Go home to seek the palace? Lie hid in the woods? The latter he was afraid, the former he was ashamed to do. While he hesitated, the dogs saw him. First Melampus, a Spartan dog, gave the signal with his bark. Then Phamphagus, Dorcius, Lelaps, Theron, Nepe, Tigris, and all the rest rushed after him, swifter than the wind, over rocks and cliffs. Through mountain gorges that seemed impassable, he fled, and they followed. Where he had often chased the stag and cheered on his pack now chased him, cheered on by his huntsmen. He longed to cry out, "I am Actaeon, recognize your master," but the words came not at his will. The air resounded with the bark of the dogs. Presently one fastened on his back, another seized his shoulder. While they held their master, the rest of the pack came up and buried their teeth in his flesh. He groaned, not in a human voice, yet certainly not in a stag's. And falling on his knees, raised his eyes, and would have raised his arms in supplication if he had them. His friends and fellow hunters cheered on the dogs and looked everywhere for Actaeon, calling on him to join the sport. At the sound of his name he turned his head. He heard them regret that he should be away. He earnestly wished he was. He would have been well pleased to see the exploits of his dogs, but to feel them was too much. They were all around him, rending and tearing, and it was not till they had torn his life out that the anger of Diana was satisfied. In Shelley's poem Adonis is the following allusion to the story of Actaeon. Midst others of less note came one frail form, a phantom among men companionless, as the last cloud of an expiring storm, whose thunder is its nail. He, as I guess, had gazed on nature's naked loveliness, Actaeon-like, and now he fled astray, with feeble steps o'er the world's wilderness, and his own thoughts along that rugged way, pursued like raging hounds their father and their prey. The illusion, it is believed, is to Shelley himself. Latona in the Rustics. Some thought the goddess in this instance more severe than just, while others praised her conduct as strictly consistent with her dignity. As usual, the recent event brought older ones to mind, and one of the bystanders told this story. Some countrymen of Lycia once insulted the goddess Latona, but not with impunity. When I was young, my father, who had grown too old for active labor, sent me to Lycia to drive thence some choice oxen, and there I saw the very pond and marsh where the wonder happened. Near by stood an ancient altar, black with the smoke of sacrifice and almost buried among the reeds. I inquired whose altar it might be, whether of Faunus or the Naiads, or some god of the neighboring mountain, and one of the country people replied, "No mountain or river god possessed this altar, but she whom royal Juno in her jealousy drove from land to land, denying her any spot of earth whereon to rear her twins." Bearing in her arms an infant deities, Latona reached this land, weary with her burden and parched with thirst. By chance she spied on the bottom of the valley this pond of clear water, where the country people were at work gathering willows. The goddess approached, and kneeling on the bank would have slaked her thirst in the cool stream, but the rustics forbade her. "Why do you refuse me water?" she said. "Water is free to all. Nature allows no one to claim as property the sunshine, the air, or the water. I come to take my share of the common blessing, yet I ask it of you as a favor. I have no intention of washing my limbs in it, weary though they may be, but only to quench my thirst. My mouth is so dry that I can hardly speak. A draught of water would be nectar to me. It would revive me, and I would own myself indebted to you for life itself. Let these infants move your pity who stretch out their little arms as if to plead from me." And the children, as it happened, were stretching out their arms. Who would not have been moved by these gentle words of the goddess? But these clowns persisted in their rudeness. They even added jeers and threats of violence if she did not leave their place. Nor was this all. They waded into the pond and stirred up the mud with their feet, so as to make the water unfit to drink. Latona was so angry that she ceased to mind her thirst. She no longer supplicated the clowns, but lifting her hands to heaven, she exclaimed, "May they never quit that pool, but pass their lives there." And it came to pass accordingly. They now live in the water, sometimes totally submerged, then raising their hands above the surface or swimming upon it. Sometimes they come out on the bank, but soon leap back again into the water. They still use their bass voices in railing, and though they have water all to themselves, are not ashamed to croak in the midst of it. Their voices are harsh, their throats bloated, their mouths have become stretched by constant railing, their necks have shrunk and disappeared, their heads are joined to their bodies, their backs are green, their disproportioned bellies white, and in short, they are now frogs, and they dwell in the slimy pool. This story explains the allusion in one of Milton's sonnets on the detraction which followed upon his writing certain treatises. I did but prompt the age to quit their clogs by the known laws of ancient liberty, when straight a barbarous noise environs me, of owls and cuckoos, donkeys, apes, and dogs, and when those hinds that were transformed to frogs railed at Latona twin-born progeny, which after held the sun and moon in fee. The persecution which Latona experienced from Juno is alluded to in the story. The tradition was that the future mother of Apollo and Diana, flying from the wrath of Juno, besought all the islands of the Aegean to afford her a place of rest, but all feared too much the potent queen of heaven to assist her rival. Delos alone consented to become the birthplace of the future deities. Delos was then a floating island, but when Latona arrived there, Jupiter fastened it with chains to the bottom of the sea, that it might be a secure resting place for his beloved. Byron alludes to Delos in his Don Juan. The Isles of Greece, where burning Sappho loved in song, where grew the arts of war and peace, where Delos rose and Phoebus sprung.